For 44 years, the royal laundresses washed Elizabeth I's linens. And in 44 years, they never found a single drop of menstrual blood. Historians called it proof she was a man in disguise. But what if the real answer wasn't hidden in her chromosomes? It was hidden in her cortisol levels, her trauma, and a body that had learned the only way to survive was to shut itself down completely. This is not a conspiracy. This is medicine. Imagine having a job where your only task is to wash the Queen's sheets every week for decades. And imagine that in all those years you never once found what every other woman in England would leave behind. In the Tudor royal household, the laundresses were among the most trusted servants in the palace. They had access to something no courtier, no ambassador, no foreign spy ever could: the most intimate evidence of the Queen's body. And what they found, or rather what they consistently failed to find, became one of the most quietly discussed secrets in the entire Elizabethan court. No bloodied linens, no stained cloths, no physical evidence across 4 full decades on the throne that Elizabeth I experienced a menstrual cycle. Ever. This wasn't rumor. This wasn't political gossip invented by enemies. The absence of menstrual evidence was documented and discussed by members of her own court. In 1559, the Spanish ambassador Feria wrote to King Philip II of Spain, expressing serious doubts about Elizabeth's ability to bear children, stating that those close to her believed she would never conceive. Sir James Melville, the Scottish envoy, recorded similar whispers circulating among diplomats by the 1560s. These were men whose entire careers depended on accurate intelligence about the Queen's reproductive capacity. Because in the 16th century, a queen's womb was a geopolitical instrument. And yet, for 44 years of reign, that instrument appeared to be completely silent. Now here is where the history books make their first mistake. Because the immediate conclusion drawn by skeptics, both in her time and in modern conspiracy circles, was that silence could only mean one thing: Elizabeth was not biologically female. The Bisley boy theory, which claims that the real Elizabeth died as a child and was secretly replaced by a local boy to avoid the king's wrath, has circulated for centuries. Bram Stoker himself wrote about it. The theory rests almost entirely on this one medical anomaly: the missing cycle. But that theory collapses the moment you introduce actual medical science into the conversation. Because there is a documented, clinically recognized condition that causes exactly this. A condition that doesn't require a conspiracy, doesn't require a body swap, and doesn't require Elizabeth to have been anything other than what she was: a biological woman who endured a level of psychological and physiological trauma that most modern humans cannot begin to comprehend. The laundry room wasn't hiding a secret about her sex, it was hiding a secret about her suffering. And to understand what her body was really doing, we have to go back to a single morning in May of 1536. The morning that, in all likelihood, changed Elizabeth's biology forever. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn was beheaded on the orders of her own husband, King Henry VIII. She was 35 years old. Her daughter Elizabeth was 2 years and 8 months old. 2 years old. That's how young she was when the state executed her mother. Now, most historians treat this as a biographical footnote, a sad detail. But modern neuroscience treats it as something far more significant: the possible origin point of a lifelong physiological trauma response. Children who experience the violent loss of a primary caregiver before the age of 3 show measurable changes in the development of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the system that regulates cortisol, stress hormones, and critically reproductive function. The brain in cases of extreme early trauma learns to treat the world as permanently dangerous. And a body that believes it is permanently in danger does not invest energy in reproduction. It invests energy in survival. This is not a theory. It is a documented medical phenomenon called functional hypothalamic amenorrhea, or FHA. In FHA, chronic psychological stress causes the hypothalamus to suppress the release of gonadotropin-releasing hormone, the hormonal signal that initiates the entire menstrual cycle. No signal, no cycle. The reproductive system doesn't malfunction. It deliberately powers down because the brain has decided that the environment is too hostile to sustain a pregnancy. And Elizabeth's environment was not just hostile, it was lethal. At 8 years old, she watched her stepmother Catherine Howard dragged screaming through Hampton Court Palace before being executed. As a teenager, she was imprisoned in the Tower of London under suspicion of treason against her own sister, Queen Mary I. She lived for years with a genuine, rational belief that any given morning could be her last. That is not stress in the modern sense of the word. That is a nervous system in a state of permanent emergency. The cortisol levels produced by that kind of chronic fear are now known to directly suppress estrogen and progesterone, the hormones essential for menstruation. Studies published in the journal Fertility and Sterility have confirmed that women in conditions of prolonged psychological trauma show measurable suppression of ovarian function, sometimes permanently if the trauma begins early enough in development. Elizabeth's trauma didn't begin in adulthood. It began before she could walk. But psychological damage was only one layer of what was breaking her body down. Because by 1562, something happened that added a second devastating blow to her already compromised endocrine system. And it left marks that her court could no longer ignore. In October 1562, Elizabeth I nearly died. The smallpox outbreak that tore through her court left her bedridden, feverish, and physically unrecognizable. She lost her hair, her skin scarred, and when she recovered, those closest to her noted that she was never quite the same physically. What the court didn't understand, but modern endocrinology does, is that a severe systemic illness like smallpox places catastrophic strain on the body's hormonal infrastructure. The adrenal glands, already overburdened by years of chronic stress, can enter a state of functional exhaustion. Cortisol production spikes violently during acute illness, and in women already predisposed to hypothalamic suppression, this kind of shock can permanently alter hormonal baselines. The hair loss Elizabeth experienced after 1562 wasn't simply cosmetic damage from fever. Diffuse hair loss, the kind she clearly suffered given that she wore wigs for the rest of her life, is a recognized symptom of hormonal dysregulation, specifically low estrogen and disrupted thyroid function. Her porcelain white skin, often romanticized as regal beauty, was partially the result of heavy lead-based makeup she used to cover scarring. But the pallor underneath was consistent with a body running on chronically depleted hormones. There was also another factor that compounded everything: her eating. Elizabeth was known to eat sparingly, and historical accounts suggest this was partly driven by a deep, rational fear of poisoning. But chronic undereating, even when deliberate, produces the same hormonal consequence as famine. The body reads it as scarcity, and it shuts down reproduction accordingly. This is precisely why amenorrhea is so common in women with restrictive eating patterns. It is not a disease, it is the body rationing resources for survival. By the mid-1560s, Elizabeth's body had absorbed three separate and compounding threats to its hormonal function: childhood trauma, chronic stress-induced cortisol elevation, and severe systemic illness. The absence of a menstrual cycle wasn't mysterious. It was, from a medical standpoint, almost inevitable. But Elizabeth was far too intelligent not to notice what her own body was telling her. And what she did with that information was nothing short of political genius. By the late 1550s, every European monarch was watching Elizabeth's marriage negotiations with obsessive interest. A queen without an heir was a throne without a future. The pressure to marry, to conceive, to produce a male successor was not just political, it was existential. And Elizabeth knew something that none of them did. She knew her body could not deliver what they were demanding. Rather than allow that vulnerability to be exposed through a medical examination, which was a very real possibility in 16th century royal marriage negotiations, where physicians could be commissioned to assess a queen's fertility, Elizabeth did something that history has consistently misread as piety or romantic idealism. She made her condition into a crown. The virgin queen identity was not born from religious devotion or a broken heart over Robert Dudley. It was a calculated medical shield. By declaring herself married to England, by constructing an entire political identity around permanent chastity, Elizabeth made any attempt to examine or question her reproductive capacity an act of political disrespect. You do not demand a fertility assessment from a woman who has already declared herself beyond such earthly concerns. It was, frankly, brilliant, and the strategy worked on multiple levels. Foreign suitors, Philip II of Spain, Archduke Charles of Austria, Francis Duke of Anjou, spent years, sometimes decades, in negotiations that Elizabeth masterfully prolonged without resolution. Each time talks grew dangerously close to commitment, she found a reason to hesitate. A diplomatic objection, a religious incompatibility, a sudden shift in foreign policy. She was not being indecisive. She was running out the clock. Because the one thing Elizabeth could never allow was a husband with legal access to her body and the right to demand an heir. a husband who would discover almost immediately that the most powerful woman in the world was physically incapable of producing one. The Virgin Queen myth didn't protect her virtue, it protected her diagnosis. And it worked so effectively that 5 centuries later, people are still debating whether she was a woman at all, rather than asking the far more important question of what kind of world forces a woman to weaponize her own medical condition just to stay alive and in power. But there is one final piece of this puzzle. Because everything we've examined, the trauma, the illness, the hormonal collapse, the political performance, all points toward a single forensic conclusion that the conspiracy theories never managed to reach. Elizabeth I was a biological woman. That is not a belief, that is the forensic verdict. Every symptom that has been used to argue otherwise, the absent menstrual cycle, the hair loss, the pale skin, the refusal to marry, the childlessness, has a complete and clinically documented medical explanation that requires no conspiracy, no body swap, and no chromosomal anomaly. What her body experienced was the predictable physiological outcome of a life spent under extreme, unrelenting psychological threat. The functional hypothalamic amenorrhea that almost certainly governed her reproductive system from early childhood was not a sign of male biology. It was the biological signature of survival. Her hypothalamus made a decision, the same decision millions of women's bodies make under conditions of severe chronic stress. That reproduction was a luxury this body could not afford. The hair loss, the hormonal depletion, the physical deterioration that accelerated in her later years. These were not the signs of a man aging beneath a costume. They were the signs of a woman whose endocrine system had been running on empty for 50 years. What is perhaps most striking is this. The very traits that fueled the conspiracy theories are the same traits that reveal the true cost of her reign. A body so traumatized, it stopped functioning reproductively. A woman so politically vulnerable that she had to transform her medical condition into a mythology just to hold on to her crown. History called her less of a woman because it didn't understand what her body had endured. Medicine, given the chance to examine the same evidence, reaches the opposite conclusion entirely. That Elizabeth's body was responding, with remarkable logic, to an environment that had been trying to kill her since she was 2 years old. The missing cycle was never proof of a man on the throne. It was proof of what the throne cost her. The amenorrhea is one piece, but the physicians who attended Elizabeth left behind records that go far deeper than what we've been able to cover here. The medical observations documented in court diaries from 1566 contain anatomical details that paint a picture of her physical condition that is, frankly, too specific for this platform. We've compiled the full forensic breakdown, primary sources, physician records, and the complete endocrinological analysis in the dossier The Tudor Enigma. Everything that couldn't be said here is in there. Link is in the description.